Hello and welcome. My name is Rebekah Mast. I'm the Vice President of Global Talent Development for Select Sires and Worldwide Sires. And with me today is our Genetic Dairy Solutions Advisor, Larry Schirm. And Larry, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what your role is here at Select Sires and Worldwide Sires?
Well, thanks, Rebekah. It's a joy to be here. Advisor is the key term that you use in the genetic solutions role that I have here at Select Worldwide. And it's a pleasure after a 40-year career in the industry to now be in this advisory role where I get the opportunity to address some of the leading genetic concerns of the day.
And it's great to have you with us and part of the team. So here at Select Sires and Worldwide Sires, some of our goals are around being more sustainable and really developing sustainability through being more innovative. And we're dedicated to finding genetic solutions that help both dairy and beef producers to reduce their environmental footprint by making ourselves the best stewards of the plant resources that are feed and also the cattle resources, by increasing efficiency through more production or more, whether that's meat or milk, and emphasizing our social responsibility, because we believe that what we do today will definitely impact our future. And one of the things that has been of interest to you and kind of a hot topic is inbreeding. And so in regards to inbreeding, when you think about that, what is it that we need to be stewarding around inbreeding?
Well, first, I like to ask the question out of the gate, if you will, Rebekah. Should we even steward inbreeding instead of just saying, how should we steward it? Should we even be stewarding it?
So what you're asking is really, is inbreeding a problem?
That's right. I'm trying to turn the question around and examine the inbreeding issue, if you will, from the standpoint that, well, what do we mean it's a problem? And you know, to address that, I've done a lot of research and I have some information in this presentation from sources of the industry. This is a couple quotes from the CDCB that are on the screen here. They make the statements, for example, inbreeding levels have been increasing, as we all know, over the past few decades. And therefore, their standard response is, of course, inbreeding should be monitored, as there have been signs of serious inbreeding depression. Fair enough. And you also see that they've made the statement, inbreeding has the same biological consequence as selection, which is an increase in homozygosity. Sounds like a big word. Homozygosity really, by trait selection, is even more targeted than when we use indexes. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go. But really, they're suggesting there's signs of some inbreeding depression. It needs to be monitored. So, okay, let's look at that further.
So maybe before we go a lot further in that, we probably just need to set a baseline around inbreeding itself, defining it, and clarifying what is inbreeding.
And I agree. And in the simplest terms, it's an inbreeding, pedigree inbreeding, if you will, I like to call it, is an indication of the degree of homozygosity at a locus within a population. Normally inbreeding is estimated in terms of a coefficient calculated from the pedigree of an individual. That's why I like to call it pedigree inbreeding, because it's based on pedigree. However, as is stated here, if no pedigree information is available or data is missing, the inbreeding coefficient cannot be estimated. So Pedigree is not a foolproof method in and of itself, particularly if the data is missing. So there's a weakness I would point out initially in the way we define inbreeding as our ability to capture what's really going on. But that's how we would define inbreeding historically. Essentially, what's the pedigree?
Yeah. So there's some definite limitations there, is what I hear you saying, in all of the assumptions that we're making, and even that those assumptions would necessarily apply across different populations.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you did mention, though, that the US rate of inbreeding is on the rise, and there's some information that would definitely support that. So, this is some information. Can you just explain what it is that we're seeing
Well,
here?
it's CDCB data here, and it shows the rate of inbreeding of the two top dairy breeds in the U.S., Holsteins and Jerseys, and they're parallel with each other. Both have been on a continual incline that has advanced over the last few decades even more dramatically, and some would say with advance of genomics, it's even picked up a faster pace. So that's the rate of inbreeding that's going on. There's no question it's climbing, as you can see, around 10% in the Holstein breed, 9% in the Jersey.
Mhm. And so then I think the biggest question is it good or bad?
Well, that's the question. Yes, I like that question because if it keeps going up and keep going up, maybe there's a good reason for it. And on this slide, you see below the Holstein inbreeding is the U.S. net merit gain in Holsteins, and they lay on top of each other. In other words, our genetic improvement parallels the inbreeding gains that we've had. So, on initial question, maybe genetic gain brings inbreeding, or maybe inbreeding brings genetic gain, or vice versa, or both. Or it's just an interesting parallel that I think begs digging deeper rather than just assuming inbreeding is a problem. Maybe there's some good with inbreeding.
Yeah, and we talk about all the time that genetics and management have to work together in order for us to get full genetic expression. And so, another chart that has been shared over the years is kind of looking at where is our production and our improvement coming from, and what we see the benefits, for example, in milk yield. Where does that stem from? And so this chart shows us those management and genetic increases. Tell us a little bit about what you see when you look at this.
This is one of my favorite slides, Rebekah, because it documents over a 60, 80-year period the progress we've made from a baseline of 1957. You can see the tremendous progress we've made in the dairy breed in the U.S., which is sustainability in and of itself and a much lower carbon footprint because we're producing a lot more milk with many fewer cows than we had 80 years ago. But to stay on the inbreeding topic, and you look at the difference between the increases due to management, as broken out here, versus genetic increase, since 1996, as stated here, 72% of the gain in milk production since 96 to 2019, 72% of it's due to genetics. Management increases have flatlined, which will come as a surprise, I imagine, to many viewing this, that we've sort of peaked, at least for now, for the last couple decades, at our advancements in milk production from management. Housing, cow comfort, nutrition. We learned a lot and we made great progress. But that's sort of flatlined. And the progress we're making today is coming from genetics. So we need to pay more and more attention, in my opinion, to genetics and make sure we're on the right track. And with that comes this inbreeding concern. So that's part of the reflection here. genetics are more and more important than ever, and inbreeding is higher and higher than ever. So what is it all? Where are we going with it? And
Yeah, so I think that is a great question, and something that I'd like you to dig into it a little bit further as far as, okay, what are some true statements and facts that we see happening and trust that, like, this is reality?
well, I think these 5 statements illustrate facts that everyone can agree upon, and a bit of a summary to this point in the presentation. The inbreeding continues to increase. The milk production continues to increase in parallel with each other. Increased milk production influenced by management is flatlined. So now we're talking about the increases are due to genetics. Genetics remain the primary contributor. In other words, another way to state number 3 is that genetics are the primary contributor to increased production. And again, production increases are directly attributed to inbreeding. They are directly attributed to inbreeding. So if they're attributed to inbreeding, maybe inbreeding is our friend. We just need to understand it more and maybe learn how to manage it in a way that we don't lose progress.
So if you were just like hearing this, maybe the first thing that someone might think is, great, we don't need to worry about inbreeding at all because you just said that these things go along with genetic progress, so I can just ignore it and stop thinking about it. Is that the approach that we should be taking?
That would be too easy. That would be fun. That would be nice if we could just say, "Hey, we're on the right path. Let's just keep going. We don't have any fallout from what we're doing. No problems will show up. We're fine." But I don't think that's quite the approach we need. I think with this statement about "don't worry about inbreeding" needs to be developed. I could say that from the statement so far, but I think we need to dig deeper.
Okay. So, yes, I would agree. I think that's something that we would say. And we definitely see that around the world. But I think, like you said, let's dig a little deeper. And maybe you can help us actually assess the genetic diversity and talk in that deeper sense about what it is that actually matters when we're thinking about inbreeding.
Well, that's the real question. What's the assessment of our genetic diversity? The estimate of the rate of inbreeding and effective population size using pedigree and genomic information. Um, it's going up and it's increasing faster with genomics. That's a fact. What's the changes in the effective population size? Well, it's smaller and smaller. In fact, there's estimates that there's less than 50 unique animals left in the North American population. Might scare some people. It's actually a fairly healthy number. We'll address that a bit more. And well, when you compare the genetic diversity, well, maintenance of genetic diversity could support long-term genetic progress. In other words, maybe our secret is of finding a way to maintain genetic diversity. So let's look at a little deeper into genetic diversity.
So I agree with the things that you're saying. What is it that other geneticists are saying? And would they agree with you? I know you've been doing a lot of work on this. What have you been gathering from them?
Right. Well, you're correct, Rebecca. I haven't been doing this in a vacuum. In fact, in 2022, there was a symposium held that brought a lot of the leaders in the industry, the genetic focused people from across the dairy industry to take a look at the inbreeding issue. And these statements here that geneticists around the world are working hard to answer the question, how do we maintain the rate of progress? What's the future consequences of inbreeding? And as the CDCB and USDA have stated here, we are actively monitoring potential new genetic defects that may affect dairy cattle. Now, I've inserted here in this blue a point that I want to drive home at this point about mutations. It's commonly thought, without really speaking it out, that inbreeding causes mutations. That's not true. Mutations happen. They happen. Inbreeding does not create them. Mutations happen.
Mhm.
Inbreeding allows us to find them, and we'll get more into that. But up front, I want to make the statement that mutations happen. Inbreeding doesn't cause them.
Mhm.
And we'll come back to that.
And with genomic information, a lot of those mutations that happen, we are able to find maybe a little more quickly than we have in the past. And so, yes, they happen. And genomics has been a great tool for us in identifying those, and also in helping us to make faster genetic progress. One of the examples I think of is how we've really seen some of our breed-leading sires being able to be sires of sons more quickly. So tell us a little bit here about, what else have genomic evaluations helped us with?
Well, people, this slide I think helps share what are the concerns of some folks. They feel inundated by sons of one bull. Whatever bull surfaces at the top, all of a sudden will become inundated in the marketplace with sons of that bull. Perfect is the example here. Utilized, but there's good reason for that, because the bull has elevated to a place we need to capture his genetics for the future. What I want to focus on here, though, is in the upper right of the slide, the genetic progress. That's the formula of how we make genetic selection. It's already been referred to a little bit here, but the selection intensity, the accuracy, the variation divided by the generation interval, and really this slide and the one following will really address the generation interval part that you see. Genomics decreasing the generation interval illustrated in the slide. Mogul, born in 2010, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations from him. In 10 years, we have frostbite.
Mhm.
That's lightning fast. And it is speeding up even faster. Our ability identify the superior genes, replicate them in the next generation, and find even higher combinations, and it's been speeded up due to genomics.
Mhm.
And of course, that's increasing the concentration of genes along a line. That's increasing the inbreeding. Here's an illustration of it. Um, so just a point of reference here, really, what it looks like. And as most of us in the industry know, this is how the speed plays out. And this is how we see the speed in the industry with a pedigree like this of frostbites that you go back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. It's only 10 years ago.
Mhm.
And that's unheard of historically.
Yeah. And that speed, as we've talked about genetic progress and the things that we can change so quickly, but then also more maybe similar bloodlines sometimes, because it is shorter that you're getting those great, great, great grandsons in the population. And so you've got more females still alive that could be related in various ways as well. So,
Right. So that's identifying the fear
yeah.
that's natural for people to have.
Yeah. So just to kind of sum it up to this point, again, the influence of the genomic evaluations really has led to faster genetic progress. We see higher accuracy because genomic testing allows us to find the animals, to identify them correctly. We have higher selection intensity with accurate identification of the animals, and then kind of focusing in on those and using them more as parents of future generations. And you just really highlighted how much genomic information has helped us in reducing the generation interval and getting that information on the parents at a younger age so that we can have more confidence in using them. So does this result in increased variation? That was the other piece in that formula. We see these three things being changed, but what has it done to our variation?
And that's the real question that we're facing with. What's it done with variation? And the report is really surprising to many, and it's exciting.
So that I think from that, and going back to some of our original questions, is this sustainable? Can we keep making this level of genetic improvement over time?
The information to date, as illustrated in this slide, is that the continued genetic improvement is sustainable. And what historically has happened that's fascinating to me. In 1950, the heritability of milk production was 25%. Today, it's 35%. How do we account for that 10% increase in heritability? That's very interesting. The more we've inbred and the more we've gotten correct identification of our population and can follow it, we have gained 10 points in the heritability of milk production. That's fascinating. I've long said that heritability essentially is our ability to measure something. How well we can measure something is a direct correlation to the heritability estimates we provide and we use. So milk production, a liter of milk is a liter of milk, a gallon of milk is a gallon of milk. But the data about the animals has become more accurate, and that's increased the heritability 10 points on milk production because we've reduced the variables within the population and made it more identified. So as stated here, over 50 generations of intense selection, commercial populations have maintained additive genetic variation in the important traits we have monitored. Additive genetic variation. That's a key point, the way the positiveness of the genes that support each other to be a profitable dairy cow have become more and more and more in line. And we'll illustrate that a little bit further in the presentation.
So with that, what I hear you saying is that our sustainability for genetic improvement is there, and we still have good options in front of us.
Yeah, for example, a statement here, Rebekah, evidence is that little variation has been lost with the introduction of genomic technology, and that such rates of genetic improvement are indeed sustainable into the future. That statement was made by a globally lead scientist from the University of Edinburgh, who studied, this is his life, this is his world, looking into genetic improvement and sustainability and the variation of our dairy population looks very positive and very sustainable, according to Dr. Hill.
So where does some of that variation come from? And are we as an AI company helping to contribute to that?
Absolutely. This slide mentions the global landscape of AI and that there's 70 companies, over 70, that have market Holstein semen around the globe. Five of the AI companies, of which we are a lead in that group of five of us have all the top 200 net merit bulls, all the top 200 net merit sources. So we are a lead contributor of that sustainable elite level of genetics. And the high selection intensity and short generation intervals that are aligned there they're naturally coming about from the environmental management conditions that foster this genetic gain. So, point being, we are among the 5 that have the top 200. There's 70 companies that market Holstein genetics. But when you talk about the genes that have been isolated to the top of the list that are the most efficient and identified for sustainability of the future, there's only 5 of us that have the top 200 in the world, which
So
is amazing.
yeah, that's big. So there's lots of diversity, but the highest level of the genetics are within a smaller population. Is that what
That's
I hear you
correct. I
saying?
mean, there's lots of genetics out there that you could use to broaden the genetic diversity, but you're dropping the profitability level. You're dropping the genetic level to bring in a broader diversity.
Mhm.
So that's a choice by any dairyman. They
Mhm.
can they can add more diversity, but I was told years ago at a sire analyst conference by Dr. Paul Miller, actually, this is 25, 30 years ago. I mentioned that we had tried a number of outcross sires and none of them really worked, providing a good son. He said, remember why they were outcross. They weren't, they didn't have any genetics that anyone wanted. That's the very definition of outcross is they don't have any genes anybody wants. The genes that everybody fights over, that the genetics that everyone wants, create this top 200 level. And we're happy to be a part of that top 200 level, a significant portion, a growing portion of that top 200. And they're the genes that we're going to talk about. Really, we're ahead of the diversity challenge on that. And I'll explain that more in a little bit as we get into this a little deeper. But um, the diversity among that group, as we get in the next slide, will help start to explain some of that.
Yeah, so then I think the question is, how do we effectively use diversity so that we can have that sustainable improvement?
Well, let me walk through what Tom Lawler presented at this conference in 2022 that, from the Holstein Association USA. And he, states that population stratification of the Holstein breed is seen over time. There's groupings, but the heavy use of popular sires has led to waves of descendants creating overlapping subpopulation with individual bulls, these smaller, more elite groups. And in that elite group, he's identified 5 clusters that have aligned themselves, and and then those of us, the major breeding organizations, have taken our subpopulation and created different subpopulations from within those subpopulations. So we're creating diverse lines within the elite subpopulations. So as you read through the average inbreeding, um, the, indicate that there's 4 clusters that have differentiated themselves in these elite populations. Now, maybe the most important statement. So he's identified what's happened. There's smaller groupings. AI has our fingers on them, and we're subpopulating them, creating diverse lines. The genetic redundancy that's done by breeding organizations creates these separate lines. This is the bottom statement here that Tom made. Um, Pursuing the overall inbreeding or the overall genetic goals um, that the industry has, maintain diversity and lower the risk of fixation or loss of alleles. In other words, these elite genes that we identify cannot have genes that will have loss within them. These genes
Mhm.
have to remain superior or they aren't in the grouping. They're fallen off. They're never marketed. They're not a part of these elite clusters.
Mhm. So we're really in that focusing in, it's a continual elimination of the genes that aren't desirable.
Yes, we're doing that work. They never enter the population. Those undesirable genes are identified, just like we were talking about with the mutation statement a minute ago, with what genomics do. The deleterious recessive genes become identified. That's
Mhm.
the beauty of genomic testing. They become identified, and then we eradicate them from the population, and they're not a part of the elite offerings that come from the industry.
Yeah. So, when we think about genetic diversity and some of the limitations of inbreeding, you've kind of selected 6 of them based on some work done by Dr. Kent Weigel. So, maybe we can just work through some of those and just go through those different statements.
Right. So quickly, and some of this is a repetitive. Loss of genetic diversity is concerning. And when you look at the overall population, Kent is right. There's some loss of genetic diversity when you look at the overall population. So there's a concern there on the forefront. And inbreeding does lead to increased homozygosity. That can be good or bad. But if it's good genes, that's a good thing. And we'll illustrate that more. Inbreeding at extremes can be shown to be lethal. Doesn't cause the lethal genes to exist, but it concentrates them. What's the beauty of that? Once they're discovered, we can eradicate them. So then when you go to number 4, inbreeding is a natural consequence of selection. That's how we've gotten to the level we're at because of the selection process. And yeah, inbreeding coefficients are at 10%, as illustrated earlier for the Holstein breed. So, what's the tipping point? And then inbreeding depression is estimated, and this is a lot of Ken's work, um, is estimated at $25 loss in a lifetime for each percentage point of increased inbreeding. And we'll illustrate that here in a moment. So Kent's work, if you raise inbreeding by a percentage point, that's effectively on average $25 loss of net income in a female's lifetime. That's sort of the rule of thumb.
So let's unpack a little bit where that $25 value comes from. Can you help with helping us understand a little bit more about,
And
how does that calculation come about and what traits are contributing to that?
and there's some work that you've worked on before too, Rebekah, that I appreciate that you already had this um, pulled together for us, but this is used by the CDCB. These factors, as you see, for each percent increase, when you look at these traits in this chart, for example, milk minus 72.9 or fat 267, et cetera, across the row, those are values applied or taken away from a bull's sire summary proof for each percentage point that he is increasing the inbreeding of the population. And we'll illustrate that in a moment. But these are regression factors applied to a proof that's taken away from a bull's proof before you ever see his proof.
Mhm.
So I think if you go to the next slide, we can illustrate it very well. So here's game day, the example. And as you see, he's 10.1 effective future inbreeding. In other words, if you use game day, that's the contributing level to the average animal in the Holstein breed. He's 10.1.
In the
Now,
US, I think it's worth pointing out
true.
it's based on the US population as well, just as a bit of a side note.
That's a great point. Thanks for that clarification, Rebekah. A population that hasn't used US genetics very much, his level would be way lower than that.
Mhm.
Um, in fact, he might not be bringing any inbreeding at all. But, excuse me, at 10.1 here, and his actual milk deviation before his proof is published is 1,005 a milk. And but his actual PTA that we see in his proof is 809. So what happened from that 1,005? Why is he only 809? And I think as you look at this, well, the average within the Holstein base currently is 7.4. There are animals up at 10% like game day. So 7.4 from the 10.1, okay, he's 2.7 increase. That's game day. So 72.9 pounds of milk times 2.7. Okay, he loses 198 pounds of milk. Ouch. So 1,005 minus 196. Yes, well, that's where that 809 comes from. So as you can see, before you ever see game day's proof, and many don't know that aren't aware of this, the inbreeding regression factors are calculated in to the sire summary proofs of the U.S. bulls. It's already, for the U.S. population, it's already taken out of their sire summary proof. So actually game day is 1,000 pound of milk bull, but he only is expressed at 809 because the assumption is if he got used on an average cow at 7.4 inbreeding level and he's 10.1, that you'll lose 196 pounds of milk in the lifetime from inbreeding. That's sort of a hedge factor that's already in place. It's being used to monitor the genetic diversity or quote the inbreeding that could happen. And again, those averages, that's based on a population average, that regression factor, and a lot of assumptions, but it's a hedge. It's a hedge. So yeah, I'm buying a bull that's 10.1 and his increase in breeding protection's already built in to the values I see. So I might actually get more.
Mm-hmm. And especially when you combine, when you talk to some well-managed herds around the world, some of the bulls, they'll say, yeah, they perform better than his proof would suggest. And in some cases, it might be because of that hedge factor, just putting that extra level of caution. But when managed right or used on a population that's maybe somewhat different than the US Holstein base, you do see that higher level of expression of the genes coming through. So lots of things to keep unpacking here.
Yeah, and so for the confidence, there's already factors built in, and breeding's not being ignored. Mm-hmm. So that point needs to be well understood as we go farther. There's already protection measures.
Yeah. So again, kind of just taking a pause here and looking at a bit of a summary. When we think about elite genetic trends, we have had a high selection focus, and this has resulted in higher frequency of the best genes, and that makes them homozygous because we want the best with the best. And you've talked about genetic progress isn't slowing. We're continuing to make great genetic progress, and we haven't tapped that out yet. So when you think about the future, what are some of our limitations, and should intensive selection be avoided?
Well, I think that becomes more the accurate question rather than saying should inbreeding be avoided. We're really talking about intensive selection. And again, back to that statement, mutations exist, and inbreeding for the desired genes allows discovery of undesirable, mutated, and lethal recessive genes. As we've stated, that's one of the principal points, one of the principal takeaways from this entire dialogue is understanding inbreeding or intensive selection doesn't create the issues. It finds genes we don't want and eliminates them. So as stated here below, once discovered allows our opportunity to isolate and eradicate. Think about HH1, 2, 3, whatever. Or when was the last time you heard about mulefoot or limberleg in Jerseys? Or, yeah, the industry has done a marvelous job, Rebekah, of discovering genes that cause economic loss, or many of the repro ones, and they get identified, and we eradicate them by doing intensive selection for the genes that we want without the ones we don't want. So, as is stated here, the homozygosity of the good genes are the top performing genes, and the inferior genes, or lower milk production, lower DPR, lower components, lower fertility, you name the trait, the lower ones, and there's a whole cluster of traits listed here, and many of the low heritability traits, we are eliminating the lower performing genes from those. That's what intensive selection will allow us to do, is separate the genes we want from the ones we don't want.
So, kind of flipping the question, then, I guess, would be, should we actually create inbreeding homozygosity?
Well, yes. In my opinion, yes. That's exactly what we're doing without stating it that way. When you look at the beginning of the presentation where we had genetic gain and inbreeding followed right along with it, which was our method of measuring it. But with our tools today, and our genetic selection tools and our selection intensity, you know, we are breeding the elite animals, and we're avoiding the inbreeding depression by concentrating additive genetic genes, additive genetic progress, additive homozygosity. That's the improved method. Not being afraid of inbreeding. Inbreeding was the tool we had when we didn't know much about what really which genes went with which animal and just how they perform. Today we know. Today we have a much better handle, and we can identify genes that would be a problem and never use them. So, the homozygosity is the key to genetic progress. So we need to create homozygosity, which is a managed form of inbreeding, if you will. In my mind, it's the improved method. We need to stay the course. We have some safeguards already in place, but really, that's the deleterious genes we want to avoid, not the genes that will add higher fertility rates, more pregnancies, longer productive life, um, lower mastitis rates, healthier feet. We want those genes.
Yeah.
And so we want intensively to select for them.
So, essentially, what we're saying is yes, we should inbreed for the good genes.
Yes. Yes. Homozygosity of the good genes separates the top performers from the inferior ones. This is the methodology that's been developed for inbreeding fewer inferior genes, as I just talked about. So homozygosity is our tool for isolation. And you'll hear talk in the future about runs of homozygosity, and old runs are better than newer runs. And I don't really want to get into all that today. That's terminology that's coming and will be illustrated through the end of the future. But really, what we're doing is eradicating deleterious genes, concentrating the good ones, inbreeding the good ones.
So, I think, from a conceptual standpoint, this all makes sense. But a lot of times people are still going to say, okay, so show me the proof, because I'm not sure I want to test this in my herd. And so I think it'd be really helpful to spend some time looking at some real herd data and actually seeing what are the genetic impacts of inbreeding and continuing to multiply those superior genes. So maybe you can give us a bit of detail and background on this genetic analysis.
Well, we're going to look at 3 different genetic analyses from a couple different dairies. There's Ideal Dairy Farm, and this report was from November 2021. And as you look at the data, here's the genomic inbreeding analysis of the herd. And of course, the older animals are on to the left of the screen, younger animals to the right. And you can see a trend line of the inbreeding level for each individual animal continues to go up in this herd. So it's a herd that's becoming more inbred, just for a point of reference. But when you look at an analysis of this herd, these are first lactation cows in November of 2021. And the top quartile here, if you look, the lowest inbreeding quartile, inbreeding level was 8.5. The highest are 15.6. So you'd expect them to be dropping over dead or something that high level. And you look at some of the traits across here, the pregnancy rate on the highest versus the lowest. The abortion rate is higher in the lowest genomic level, the lowest inbreeding level, and the turnover rate, most importantly, when you get out to the right there, 24% versus 12% of those first lactation animals, the lower inbred left the herd twice as fast as the higher inbred. Or you look at the traits listed below, the abortions, the DNB sold, etc. Kind of a bit of a surprise. You would expect the inbred ones to be the ones that have the problem, not the ones that have the low inbreeding.
And I think that's really important to be able to look at, because often when people think of inbreeding, okay, yeah, there might be some production depression, but a lot of the fear is around you're going to have less healthy animals, you're going to have more disease, more illness, a lot of reasons that people maybe in the past would have gone to crossbreeding was to try to avoid these sort of problems. But maybe the benefit is actually by selecting more intensively for the good genes that we want. And we see that in this example here.
Exactly. That's a great point, Rebekah. So let's look at the second lactation animals of this very same herd. And you see, well, in second lactation, again, the higher inbred quartile, twice as high, now has a higher preg rate and still lower abortions. I have a few more mastitis, but the turnover rate's pretty flat. A lot of the bad ones left first lactation, but you're not seeing what you would expect. You would expect, without really thinking about it, all these lower inbred ones would be better performers. Not such the case. So let's look at another herd, if you would. This Homestead Dairy, and their inbreeding clearly has continued to go up, as is illustrated here for the record. So again, their highest quartile is twice as high, their lowest quartile for inbreeding. The days open are lower on the more inbred group. Abortion rates, DNBs. Half as many animals are sold out of the first lactation or died. The turnover rate 16% of the inbred ones, 31% of the low inbred ones. The laminitis is much higher on the low inbred ones. Just upside down from what you would expect to see. And your question, what does it look like in well-bred herds, top performing herds that are increasing in inbreeding using top level genetics? Here's what we're seeing. This is kind of anecdotal, but we're seeing this trend more and more. And that's part of the point of illustrating when you say, show me the proof. Well, let's look at second lactation in this same herd at the same period of time, January of 2021. Second lactation, again, we see the very same pattern. We saw first lactation. Half of the lowest inbred second lactation animals have left the herd, died, sold, what have you. 49% are gone. That is, well, why is the lower inbreeding group, Rebekah, why are they the ones leaving the herd? Maybe they're the ones with the inferior genes.
Yeah, they clearly don't have the genetics for resisting abortions. They're, for whatever reason, they're being labeled as do not breeds. There are more incidents of lameness, higher incidents of mastitis. So there's things there that in these genetics, they've not been selected for those traits that really impact productive life and stability.
So these lower levels of genes are the lower inbred genes are the ones eliminating themselves from the herd. They're the underperformers.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones not staying. To try to lower inbreeding means we want to use those lower end genes. Yeah. Effectively, that's what that's saying, which is counterintuitive. Why we're going through this exercise here that you and I are going through, Rebekah, because our historic approach to inbreeding has been somewhat counterintuitive to what we can do today with the tools we have and the understanding that we have. Our ability to eliminate deleterious genes so we don't apply them to the population. And this is a great example. I don't want a heifer out of that lower quartile. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're lower inbred. I don't want a heifer from those.
No.
I only want heifer from the inbred group because they're the ones going to make me money.
And I think when I first saw this, my question was, when I was part of doing this analysis back in 2021, my thought was, is it going to hold true if we do it again in another year? Inbreeding continues to increase. Are we still going to see the same thing? Was this just a chance, that a snapshot in time? All of those sort of questions. And doing this again a year later with the same herd, different population of animals, because now they're getting older. But again, that it's coming through again.
Yes. The inbreeding level is twice as high still in the highest quartile, and numbers very much like a year prior as far as the differences here. And clearly, I want these inbred ones. Even, here's the newest ones. And when you go to the second lactation animals of the same herd, we saw them as first lactation a year ago. The trend has still continued. Half of the lower inbred have left the herd, second lactation, died, sold, what have you. And those inbred cows, hey, only 20% of them left. They're the ones, and that's when they finally have become paid for. Mm-hmm. 4 out of 5 of that highest quartile remained in the herd second lactation. And they're the ones paid for. They're the ones I'm finally making money on, that they don't owe anything. Mm-hmm. They're paid for. And 4 out of 5 of that group, I still have. I only have half of the lower group. So I have to make up those losses somewhere. This clearly indicates on the surface, I want inbred animals every day, which flips the whole scenario on its head. But again, we're dealing with elite level genetics. We're not dealing with the average of the population, the lower end of the population. We're dealing with the elite group.
Yeah.
And that's the point. What we've isolated our genes to today is really what we want to keep intently selecting for, because we've eradicated much of what is known as inbreeding depression, what would cause the inbreeding depression historically, which were accurate measurements and the best we had from the tools we had at the time. That's changed.
Yeah.
And these data reports here are quick illustrations of what we're seeing and what has us very excited about as we move forward. Do not be afraid of the inbreeding that you'll see on a pedigree. It's how you manage those genes. And I think if you go to the next slide, Rebekah.
I just wanted to pause there a second first before we get into that. I think what's really key as you're talking about this as well is these are known animals. So like in going to this next slide, you have to know what it is that you're getting. It's not just a random population that's known genetics. It's known pedigrees. These are genomic tested animals that they're both elite, but it's also not just this total randomization that we would have had in the past where we didn't really know what genes they were carrying or which sire they were by, whatever the case might be.
Exactly. You know, when these three quick questions here, should we avoid inbreeding? Well, as you were describing eloquently, Rebekah, it's really what genes are we talking about? What group of genes are we discussing on whether or not to be concerned about inbreeding? Are they desirable genes or are they superior genes? That's really what's the population of females we're breeding from, and who are they? And have we already eradicated a lot of the bad things? And are we using a genetic source that has the deleterious genes isolated away from them? Yes, we want to intently breed those together. And everything indicates that's how we continue to advance and isolate the profitable genes. And again, as we illustrated, genetic progress is really our avenue to make further progress today. Management needs to find some more answers to really contribute to progress in the future. And I'm not saying that's not coming. It might well be coming. But we haven't seen it for a couple decades, and genetics are the horse we're riding right now. And these superior genes need to be managed differently. In my opinion, our opinion, I think is part of the message here. The way you manage your grandfather's Farmall A or the way he drove the horse and buggy is different from the rocket fuel cows that we have today. And the way we manage these superior genetics needs a new approach, needs a different look. And the fear we've had of inbreeding historically needs a new conversation. So,
and I think we're showing our generation differences talking about a Farmall A. For those who don't know, that's a tractor. And I don't remember my grandpa driving one, but I do remember hearing about them. So,
okay.
But just to clear that up, I think you're absolutely right, Larry. And really, when we talk about inbreeding, our focus needs to be on how are we actually moving forward genetically? How are we managing our herds to really do what Select Sires and Worldwide Sires have been really promoting for the last couple of years with the Make Longevity Her Legacy campaign. That is our purpose and our ultimate goal. And so don't get hung up on just one piece of that out of fear, but look at the whole picture and understand that we're not in the same era that we were 50 years ago when we didn't know all of these different dynamics and elements. We're in a very different era today.
We certainly are, and we've done much to clean up the genetic profile of our population. And we, the risk of inbreeding, the risk of breeding and further generations, the deleterious genes of the past, many of those have been eradicated.
Mhm.
So we're breeding from a different animal today than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, Larry, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for all of the research that you've put into this. There have been hours of looking at information from different, very reputable sources and pulling all of this together into one compilation of data for us to be able to really look at from both the research side and very practical is just so helpful for us as we continue to have these conversations, think about this for our own herds, for customers' herds, and as an industry, how we keep improving. So thank you for
Yes.
all of that.
Thank you, Rebekah. Genetic progress is our passion, and so
Absolutely.
we'll stay on course.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.